Next fly we're going to tie is a Griffith Gnat. This is a little midge adult pattern that can also double as a midge cluster, which would represent a group of midges skittering around on top of the water in a bundle. This fly is going to be tied on a ring-eyed light wire dry fly hook. In this case it's a TMCO 101. This is a size 18, but this can range anywhere from a size 14 down to a 24. So a pretty big range of sizes for a midge pattern. I'm going to tie this with 8/0 unithread. The round configuration of this thread will keep it from spreading out and kind of keep it a little tighter on the hook. We don't have a whole lot of thread work on this fly, but the lack of stretch in this thread will help to anchor down the hackle feather that we're going to work with and keep the body thin at the same time. So what I'll do here to start is I'm going to start my thread just behind the hook eye, and I'll make a nice even thread base all the way back to the bend of the hook. So I'm just going to make nice tight continuous turns all the way back to the bend so that I've got a thread base here. I always want to tie on top of a thread base. If I leave bare metal, it's very easy to pull a material out. If I tie my hackle feather in to bare hook, at some point it'll be pretty easy to pull that feather out. So I always want to start with a thread base. Now the next thing that I've got to do is I've got to size a hackle to the fly here. And we're tying, like I say, a size 18 Griffith Gnat. So we want a feather, I've sort of pre-sized this one, and it's a little on the small side, but it'll work. But the idea of what we're shooting for here, if I take this feather and bend it, the relation of the hackle fibers themselves to the gap of the hook, in this case those hackle fibers are about equal to the gap of the hook, which is what I like for a Griffith Gnat. I like to undersize that hackle a little bit. If you were to buy pre-sized hackle, generally the hackle would be about a half again the hook gap distance beyond the point. A typical sized feather, a correctly sized size 18 feather for this hook, would have hackle fibers that are about 1.5 times the hook gap. In this case, this feather is going to be a little undersized. It just makes the fly set a little lower on the water. So I've got a slightly undersized grizzly hackle feather here, and this is going to be our body hackle. I'm going to strip just the bottom end of this feather of its fibers, leaving an exposed stem that's about a half a shank long. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the inside and outside of the feather here. The side that's facing you right now is the outside of the feather, the outside being the convex side. The inside, concave side, has got a little cup to it, and I want to tie this feather in with the outside of the feather facing up. That will determine how the feather wraps as I wrap it up the hook. So I'll take this feather, I'm going to lay it in at the bend, and very similarly to the way we tied the wire on the Black Beauty, I'm going to set it in that right angle between the thread and the hook shank, and I'll catch it with a couple turns of thread. My feather right now is laying with the outside of the feather out and the inside of the feather down toward the hook shank. I'm going to continue wrapping forward over this stub end that I've got here, back up to the hook eye, or to just short of the hook eye, as the case may be. For the body on this fly, I'm going to use some peacock curl from the eye of the quill. This is a whole peacock feather here, and up in the eye where it's got the pretty center section, I'm going to clip that section out. This herl in the eye is much finer than the herl found toward the base of the feather. These herls make a much bushier body, and on a size 18 fly, they'd still be okay. But the herl in the eye is much finer and is going to be much more proportioned to the hook size in this case. So I'm going to take the eye, I'm going to strip off, 8 or 10 fibers. And one of the things that I'll do with peacock curl is I always tie it in by its tip ends, never by the butt ends. And I'll show you why here. The tip ends have this nice green sheen, real metallic look. The butt ends, you can see the backside here, are real woody and rough, very thick. They're not going to create the body that we want to. So I'm going to tie these in by the tip ends. So what I'll do first is I'm going to clip the very tips off so they're all square. And I'm going to lay this down on top of the hook. Now you can tie this down with a couple different methods. What I'll use here is sort of a loose wrap. I'm going to bring the thread up and over, but I almost lose all tension here as I come over the top of the hook, and I'll snap the thread toward me to lock it down. In real time, it's a much smoother move, and I'm just going to catch that with a turn, and I'll pull these fibers down to length as I wrap back. Now, I'm going to do that one more time just to kind of walk through that. The technique of catching this and tying it down is I'm going to have my thread here. I'm going to come up and over and catch it. Now you can see I've tied that in well back from the tips. Rather than come in and trim those tip ends off and waste both the material and the step, I'm going to pull my thread toward me and I'm going to draw these fibers down on top of the shank to save that step and preserve a little bit more of the material. Now I'll wrap back over the peacock curls all the way back to the bend and forward again to the index point, trying to keep as smooth an underbody there as I can. Now I'm going to wrap these peacock curls around the hook to form the body. Peacock curl is inherently delicate, so you've got to be a little light-handed with it. And the reason we tied 6 or 8 of these in is because if one breaks, it's no big deal. We'll just clip off what's left of it and go on with the rest. So I'm going to take these curls all at the same time, and I'm going to try to wrap these as flat as I can. See how this is making a wide ribbon of material? Try to wrap these as flat as I can up to the index point, making a nice, fuzzy, smooth body. I'll switch hands and I'll tie the herl off with a couple turns of thread. Then I'm going to come in and I'm going to trim this as close as I can. You notice that I'm using my fine tip scissors here so that I can get right down close and not leave a big long stub sticking out at the front of the fly. I'm going to finish that off with just a couple of turns to cover the stub ends of that peacock curl body. And now I'm going to wrap my hackle. Now this is the tip end of a saddle feather here, which gives me plenty of length to wrap with my fingers. If I was using a neck feather that maybe was only this long, I could go in and use my hackle pliers to help wrap that. But in this case, my fingers will do just fine. This feather's long enough to work with. As I start to wrap this feather, I'm going to palmer it, and that's evenly spaced turns, much like we did with the wire wrap on the Black Beauty. I'm going to palmer this feather forward from the back of the hook to the front. And I want to try to keep the outside of the feather facing the hook eye as I wrap. Or the concave side back. So as I wrap, I'll put my first turn at the bend, and my front side of the feather is still facing the hook eye, and I'm just going to try to evenly space these wraps as I work up the hook. The number of turns is sort of up to you. This is a relatively heavily dressed Griffith gnat right now. I think I had 7 or 8 turns there. You could do several more turns for a particularly bushy fly, or half that many turns for a sparser pattern. Any of which are okay. It just depends on what you're after. Now when I get to the front here, I'm going to hold the feather straight up above the hook. I'm going to bring the thread straight up and over it. I have tyers ask me all the time, how do you prevent hackle fibers from sticking out over the hook eye? The trick is right there. When you tie your feather off, pull it straight up and bring your thread straight up and straight down. If you hold your hackle feather out over the hook eye, you can see the fibers that are sticking out there. If I hold it straight out over the hook eye, I'm going to bind those fibers there. If I hold it straight up, I can get in between those fibers and keep them from sticking out over the hook eye and crowding things up when I tie my tippet on. Now I'm going to trim this hackle feather. Now there's a trick to doing this as well. Rather than just come in and scissor off as close as I can get, I'm going to grab this feather as close to that eye as I can and stick my scissors right in between my fingers and the hook. And I'm going to pull up on the feather, and I'm going to push down on the scissors to make a nice clean cut in there so there's no stub end. I've also got those little loose fibers that were in there came out with that one clip as well. Now ordinarily you could go back in and trim those out and it's no big deal. It's just a little quicker, more efficient way to do it. So we've got our fly essentially tied now. We're going to put a whip finish, and again it's a standard 3 to 5 turn whip finish. You want to be sure not to catch any of the hackle fibers as you do that. Trim your thread off, and that's our Griffith snap.